The drunk man in the front row lurched to his feet and started shouting about Sammy Davis Jr. Quote, "Cess fake eye," when Dean Martin set his microphone down on the table and walked toward him. Frank Sinatra froze on stage. The orchestra kept playing for 3 seconds before anyone thought to stop them. Wait, because what Dean said in the next 45 seconds got repeated in every bar in Vegas that night, and it changed the way Sammy walked on stage for the rest of his life, but nobody understood what it cost Dean to do it. The Sands showroom was packed that Saturday in February 1957. 300 people in tuxedos and evening gowns, cigarette smoke drifting through the stage lights, the kind of crowd that came to Vegas expecting polish and danger in equal measure. Dean had finished his second number. Frank was lounging against the piano waiting for his cue, and Sammy was in the middle of a solo tap routine that had the whole room leaning forward in their seats. Sammy's feet moved so fast, they blurred. His arms swept through the air with a precision that made it look effortless, and his face held that expression he always wore when he danced, pure concentration wrapped in joy. He'd been back on stage for 2 years since the car accident that took his left eye, and he'd worked himself into a shape that nobody thought was possible. The protez looked real enough that most people in the audience didn't even know he'd lost the eye, unless they'd read about it in the papers. Dean watched from the side of the stage, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of what looked like whiskey, but was actually apple juice. He'd seen Sammy rehearse this routine 14 times in the past week, and every time Sammy nailed it, Dean felt something tighten in his chest. Not jealousy, pride, maybe, or fear that one day Sammy wouldn't be able to hold it together anymore under the weight of everything Vegas made him carry. The man in the front row had been drunk since before the show started. Dean had spotted him during the first number, red face, loose tie, the kind of swagger that comes from too much money and not enough boundaries. He'd been whispering to the woman next to him, loud enough that the people around them kept glancing over, but he'd stayed quiet until Sammy took center stage. Then he stood up. "Look at that fake eye." The words cut through the music like a knife through silk. "Dancing knee." Dean didn't let him finish. He set his microphone on the table next to Frank's drink, not dropped, not thrown, just placed it down with the kind of care that made everyone in the room understand. This wasn't improvisation. This was a choice. Then he walked to the edge of the stage, 5 steps that felt like 50, and stopped directly in front of the man. The orchestra stumbled to a halt. Sammy's feet stopped mid-step. Frank straightened up from the piano, his hand hovering near his jacket pocket in a gesture that looked casual but wasn't. "Notice something here." Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He just stood there, looking down at the man with an expression that could have frozen bourbon mid-pour. The drunk man blinked up at him, suddenly aware that 300 people were staring, suddenly aware that Dean Martin, was standing 3 feet away with murder in his eyes and a smile on his lips that didn't reach anywhere near his face. "You got something to say?" Dean's voice was quiet, conversational, the kind of tone you'd use to ask someone to pass the salt. "Say it louder. I don't think everyone heard you." The man's mouth opened, closed. His companion grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back into his seat, but he shook her off. "You were just what?" Dean took 1 step closer, not threatening, curious, making sure we all knew you had eyes. 2 of them, right? Both real? The man nodded, confused now, the anger draining out of him and getting replaced with something that looked like panic. "That's funny," Dean said. He turned to address the room, his voice carrying to the back tables without effort. "This man has 2 real eyes, but he still can't see talent when it's standing right in front of him. Somebody want to explain that to me?" Silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Look at this moment from above, because what's about to happen only makes sense if you understand who was watching. The Sands wasn't just any nightclub. The people in that room ran half of Vegas, and most of the money flowing through it. They were there to see Dean and Frank and Sammy, because these three men represented something Vegas needed: proof that the city could be elegant and dangerous, and just barely respectable enough to attract the kind of high rollers who drop 50,000 on a weekend and come back next month to do it again. But those people also expected order. They expected the performers to perform, and the audience to applaud, and everyone to stay in their designated role. What Dean was doing right now wasn't part of anyone's script. A security guard appeared at the end of the row, moving toward the drunk man with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd thrown out 100 troublemakers before breakfast. Dean saw him coming and held up one hand. No, the guard stopped. He stays. Dean's voice had lost its conversational tone. Now it was steel wrapped in velvet. He's gonna sit right there and watch every second of what Sammy does next, and if he opens his mouth again, I'll stop the show and we'll all sit here in silence until he learns some manners. The drunk man sat down, fast. His companion was already halfway to crying. Dean turned back to Sammy, who was still frozen in the middle of the stage, his face unreadable. Dean caught his eye and nodded once. Just a small movement, barely visible, but Sammy saw it. Then Dean walked back to his microphone, picked it up, and said, "Take it from the top, Sammy, and make it count." Remember this part, because it's where the story gets complicated. Sammy didn't start dancing right away. He stood there for 3 seconds, long enough that Frank shifted his weight, and the piano player flexed his fingers on the keys, unsure whether to start the music. Sammy's jaw was tight, and his hands were clenched at his sides, and for one terrible moment, it looked like he might walk off stage and never come back. Then he smiled. Not the performance smile, the one he wore like armor. A real smile, small and crooked, aimed directly at Dean. And when he started dancing again, it wasn't the routine they'd rehearsed. It was something else, something faster and sharper. A sequence of moves that had the whole room gasping because nobody had seen Sammy do anything like this before. His feet hammered the stage in a rhythm that sounded like gunfire. His arms cut through the air in gestures that looked like he was conducting a symphony of fury and grace. He spun twice, impossibly fast, and landed on one knee with his arms spread wide and his head thrown back, and the protez eye caught the stage lights and threw them back at the audience like a challenge. The room exploded. 300 people stood up at once, applauding so hard the chandeliers rattled, and the drunk man in the front row was clapping too, his face pale and his eyes wide like he'd just witnessed something holy. Dean watched from the side of the stage. He wasn't smiling anymore. His hands were shaking just enough that he had to grip the microphone stand to keep them steady. And when Frank came over and put a hand on his shoulder, Dean didn't look at him. "You okay?" Frank's voice was low, meant only for Dean. "Yeah." Dean's voice didn't sound convincing even to himself. "What you just did had to be done. That guy's probably connected. You know that, right? We're gonna hear about this." Dean finally looked at Frank. "Good. Let him hear about it." But here's what Dean didn't say out loud. What he couldn't say because admitting it would make it real. He'd just painted a target on his own back in a city where targets didn't last long. The drunk man might have been connected, might have had friends who'd remember this moment and hold it against Dean for the next 20 years. The casino bosses who hired them might decide Dean was more trouble than he was worth. The other performers who saw what happened might start wondering if Dean would defend them too, and what it would cost them if he did. Every choice has a price. Dean knew that better than most, but he also knew that some things were worth paying for. And watching Sammy stand alone against a room full of people who thought his protez eye made him less than human wasn't one of the things Dean could walk away from. The show went on. Dean did his next number with the same easy charm he always brought. Frank told a joke that had the room laughing again, and by the time they took their final bow together, most of the audience had convinced themselves the incident with the drunk man was part of the act. Vegas was good at that. turning ugly moments into entertaining stories, smoothing over the rough edges until everything looked like it had been planned from the start. But Sammy knew. Dean could see it in the way Sammy stood a little straighter during the group bow, the way he caught Dean's eye backstage and nodded without saying anything. Frank knew too, though Frank's version of knowing involved pouring 3 fingers of actual whiskey and handing it to Dean without comment. They had 20 minutes before the second show. Dean sat in his dressing room with the whiskey untouched on the table in front of him, listening to the muffled sounds of the crew resetting the stage. Someone knocked on the door and he called, "Come in," expecting Frank or maybe the stage manager with a question about timing. It was Sammy. He stood in the doorway for a second, still in his stage costume, the sequins catching the harsh dressing room light. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I'm not going to say thank you," Sammy said, "because saying thank you makes it sound like what you did was optional, and we both know it wasn't." Dean picked up the whiskey glass, looked at it, set it back down. "You don't owe me anything, Sammy." "I know." Sammy sat down in the chair across from Dean, his movements careful, controlled. "That's not what this is. I'm just saying." He stopped, started again. "I've been doing this for 2 years, since the accident. Every night I walk out there, and I know half the room is waiting to see if I can still do it with one eye, waiting to see if I'm gonna trip or miss a step, or lose the beat, and I prove them wrong every time. But it never stops. They never stop waiting." Dean didn't say anything. He'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone was shut up and let them talk. "Tonight was different," Sammy continued. "Tonight, for the first time, I didn't have to prove anything by myself. You were there, and Frank, and that drunk bastard had to sit there and watch me, and he couldn't look away, and I could see it in his face. He got it. He finally got that. I'm not some circus act. I'm a performer. Best damn dancer in Vegas, fake eye or not. Second best," Dean said. His voice was light, teasing. "I saw you miss that turn in the third measure." Sammy laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and Dean felt something in his chest unclench just slightly. "Seriously, though," Sammy said, "what you did out there, that's gonna follow you. You know that, right?" "Yeah, you could have let security handle it." "I could have, but you didn't." "No." Sammy nodded slowly, like he was processing something. Then he stood up and walked to the door. "Before he left, he turned back. The routine I did after you shut that guy up, that wasn't what we rehearsed. I noticed. I've been working on it for 3 months. I was gonna save it for the big show next month, the one with all the Hollywood people. But tonight felt like the right time to bring it out." He paused. "Because of what you gave me. That moment where I knew someone had my back. I needed that." Dean didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. After Sammy left, Dean sat alone in the dressing room for another 10 minutes. The whiskey was still untouched. The sounds from the stage had faded to a distant murmur. He could hear Frank's voice in the hallway, laughing with someone from the crew, and the faint sound of the orchestra tuning up for the second show. Stop for a second and picture what happens next, because this is where most people get the story wrong. They think Dean Martin walked back on stage that night, and everything went back to normal. They think the drunk man was an isolated incident, a momentary disruption in an otherwise smooth evening. They think Dean's defense of Sammy was a one-time gesture, a burst of righteous anger that faded as soon as the applause died down. But that's not what happened. What happened was this: Dean Martin walked back on stage for the second show, and he saw the way the audience looked at him differently now. Not worse, exactly, but different, uncertain, like they weren't sure whether he was going to entertain them or challenge them. And Dean realized that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, that from this moment forward, every performance would carry the weight of that choice he'd made in front of 300 people. The casino bosses noticed too. They didn't say anything directly. Not that night. But Dean could read the room well enough to know that conversations were happening behind closed doors. Conversations about whether Dean Martin was becoming a liability, whether his loyalty to Sammy Davis Jr. was going to cause problems with certain guests who expected their prejudices to be tolerated as long as they kept spending money. Frank noticed. He didn't bring it up directly, but Dean caught him watching with a look that was equal parts admiration and worry. Frank Sinatra had his own demons to fight, his own battles with the establishment, and he recognized what Dean had done, not just standing up for Sammy, but doing it publicly, in a way that couldn't be walked back or explained away. The second show went smoothly. Dean hit every note, landed every joke, charmed the audience into forgetting about the incident from the first show. By the time they took their final bow, the room was on its feet again, applauding with the kind of enthusiasm that could almost convince you everything was fine. But Dean knew better. He'd spent too many years reading rooms, understanding the subtle shifts in energy that meant the difference between success and failure. And he could feel it now, the slight change in temperature, the way certain people in the crowd looked at him with calculation instead of simple enjoyment. That night, after both shows were done and the crew was breaking down the stage, Dean walked out through the back entrance of the Sands into the parking lot. The desert air was cold, sharp enough to make him pull his jacket tighter. His car was parked in its usual spot, but he didn't head toward it right away. Instead, he stood there for a minute, looking up at the neon signs that lit up the strip, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was going to happen because of it. Someone walked up beside him. Dean didn't have to look to know it was Frank. "You thinking about what comes next?" Frank asked. "Always? It's going to get complicated. It already is." Frank lit a cigarette, the flame from his lighter briefly illuminating his face. "You don't regret it, though?" It wasn't a question, but Dean answered anyway. "No." "Good." Frank took a drag, exhaled slowly. "Because Sammy's gonna remember this for the rest of his life. What you did tonight, that's the kind of thing that matters." Dean thought about Sammy's face backstage, the way he'd said he didn't need to prove anything by himself anymore, thought about the drunk man's expression when he finally understood what he was watching, thought about the 300 people who'd witnessed something they'd be talking about for years. "Yeah," Dean said quietly. "It matters." They stood there for a while longer, not saying anything, just two men in the desert night, thinking about choices and consequences and the price you pay for doing the right thing when nobody's forcing you to do it. Listen to this part carefully, because it's where the real cost becomes clear. Over the next 6 months, Dean Martin noticed things changing, not dramatically. Vegas was too subtle for that, but changing nonetheless. Certain casino owners stopped returning his calls as quickly. Certain booking agents started mentioning scheduling conflicts for venues that had always been available before. Nothing anyone could point to and say, "This is retaliation." But Dean knew he'd made powerful people uncomfortable, and they were reminding him in small ways that power in Vegas meant the ability to make your life difficult without ever raising a fist. But here's the thing. Nobody talks about. Dean didn't back down. He kept working, kept performing, kept standing next to Sammy on stage every night like nothing had changed. And gradually, painfully slowly, other performers started to do the same thing, started refusing to work venues that wouldn't let Sammy through the front door, started calling out audience members who crossed the line, started understanding that sometimes your career meant less than your integrity. It took years. It cost Dean opportunities and money in relationships with people who'd rather pretend the problem didn't exist. But it happened. And when historians talk about the civil rights movement in entertainment, they usually focus on the big public moments, the speeches and the boycotts. They don't talk about the night Dean Martin put down his microphone and walked to the edge of a stage to face down a drunk man who thought Sammy Davis Jr. S protez I made him something less than human. The countdown to midnight was still 2 hours away, when Dean finally headed to his car that night. Frank had gone back inside to settle something with the stage manager. Sammy had already left, probably heading to one of the after-hours clubs where the real Vegas showed its face once the tourists went to bed. Dean sat in his car for a minute before starting the engine, his hands on the steering wheel, thinking about tomorrow night's show and the night after that, and all the nights stretching out into a future he couldn't quite see clearly anymore. He'd made a choice. It was the right choice. But right choices aren't the same as easy choices. And Dean Martin had just learned that sometimes standing up for your friends means standing in the line of fire yourself. The engine turned over with a smooth rumble. Dean pulled out of the parking lot and onto the strip where the neon signs blazed bright enough to make you forget about the darkness just beyond their reach. He drove past the Flamingo and the Desert Inn and the Tropicana, all those palaces of illusion where people came to pretend they were someone else for a weekend. But Dean Martin wasn't pretending anymore. He'd shown everyone exactly who he was, and there was no taking it back now. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. And if you want to know what happened the next time Dean and Sammy took the stage together, when the casino owner himself tried to interfere, tell me in the comments.